Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, YouTubers. This is Jerry Diamond, How to Get Out of Babylon. Reading We Interrupt This Program by A.T. Hagan. We're getting toward the end of it. This is May 1st. I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and and I said, it's been a long time since I've read it, so it's basically, as I read it, I'm, relearning the story because I don't remember it, which is a nice thing about having a bad memory. Louis L'Amour stories, I could read them 3 or 4 times, and get to the last page and go, oh yeah, I read this one before, because they're all kind of the same. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and read this chapter and probably just one tonight. I guess stretch it out. I kind of was thinking about getting it done by a certain date, but I'm not going to worry about it. So anyway, Spring, Sprang, Sprung, Part 1, May 1st, Spring, Sprang, Sprung. The earth was soft under his feet as John walked across the plowed field, softly whistling the shaker hymn, Simple Gifts, that his wife had introduced him to long ago. He stopped occasionally to run his hand into the turned soil to gauge its warmth. It still smelled faintly of the manure he'd sprayed on it 3 days before. What you always want to do is stick your hands in manure. It had been an expensive trip up into the Florida Panhandle, both in terms of fuel and trade goods, to acquire the liquid manure sprayer a bankrupt hog farmer had advertised in the state market bulletin, but he felt it had been worth it. The first couple of times they'd emptied the gas digester of its spent feedstock, they'd had to dip the effluent out of barrels with buckets to apply it to the ground, which made it for a slow, tedious, stinking, and nasty experience. Now he could simply pull the sprayer behind the tractor and put the entire load down in about half an hour. The wheat that had been the first crop to be fertilized with the nutrient-laden waste was now a beautiful emerald green and much denser in its stand than before the application. He smiled every time he looked across the small waving green fields of his grain plantings and the plowed earth of plantings yet to come. In the pastures he could see the goats and the greatly expanded poultry flock happily experiencing the new spring grass. Even Dandelion the cow would occasionally kick up her heels as she filled herself on the lush growth after months of hay. It had been a long winter that seemed to him filled with death and destruction. It felt good to see life returning and the eternal promise that every spring had made plain once more. That every spring held made plain once more. It felt good to see life returning and the eternal promise that every spring held made plain once more. It felt good to see life returning and the eternal promise that every spring held made plain once more. That was good for 3 reads, okay? So I will look forward to spring, see what this winter holds. And what new life holds after some death, So, been enough killing, enough dying, enough crying to last me for my lifetime, he spoke aloud to himself. Time to see some new life and living again. After checking a half-dozen points across the field, he decided the ground had finally warmed to the point that he could plant his corn. 55 degrees. 5, or 50 degrees, bare minimum. He didn't have enough of the yellow dent variety that he'd been conserving and improving to plant as much area as he wanted this year, so he'd made another expensive deal with Bill at the Archer Feed and Seed store in order to order in enough of a different open pollinated dent corn by the name of Hickory King to make up the difference, and that is what he'd be putting in first. A month later he'd put in his variety, which he would one day call Horn's Dent, when he'd finally attained the ear length and sturdiness of stalk he felt it was capable of achieving. By isolating the 2 plantings in time this way, he hoped that he could avoid cross-pollination difficulties. Not that having these 2 particular varieties cross would be disastrous. They were both good, solid, OP strains, open-pollinated, but it would mess up his development program for several years. He'd briefly considered planting a hybrid strain for the extra yield it would bring, but had decided against it since it would not breed true the next season, which meant he'd have to buy seed again if it inadvertently crossed with his own variety. It could take years to undo the damage. No kidding. He walked back across the field, this time heading towards the garden to check on the growth of the new tomato plants he'd put in the week before. They were an exception to his open-pollinated rule in that they were a disease-resistant hybrid and so far showing remarkable growth. This pleased him greatly because they had several hundred more coming along in the greenhouse destined for the Archer market, along with peppers, eggplants, and other vegetable seedlings he hoped would sell well. It would be good for the farm to begin to pay for itself at last. Their outgo had far exceeded their income these last several months, and the house coffers were becoming sadly depleted. After a long delay to build the tools they needed to produce the products they wanted to sell, then waiting for the weather to warm enough for gardens to be put in, the Horn farm is finally ready to take a place at the market to sell its wares. Anne and the children had been crafting the table presentation for days, and he thought it looked pretty good. His niece Cindy had proved to be an able hand with a drawing pen and paintbrush. They'd even had all of the kids dressed in coveralls and bright plaid shirts to make a photograph of them holding baskets of ripe, attractive produce from the greenhouse, truth be told, with Neil in front wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat holding their most photogenic Rhode Island red hen under one arm and a wire basket full of colorful brown and white eggs in the other. John thought the hack looked ridiculous, but the females had outvoted him. Silly hat or not, he fancied that photograph and had an extra copy made to hang in the living room. He'd mailed a smaller copy of the photo to Carla, who he was sure would be delighted. He planned to have another photo made of just him and Anne standing in front of the house, pitchfork in hand, a la American Gothic, to hang beside it. After looking over the tomatoes, he picked up an empty bucket from a fence post and started picking yellow squash, then moved on to cut a few heads of cabbage. A faint rumble of thunder rolled across the pasture. He looked up to see the weak, cold front which had been predicted for the day making its approach. He judged he had enough time to finish his gathering before the advancing rain made it to him, so he went back to his task. When his bucket had reached its capacity, he left the garden and sink and walked to the house, entering through the back door to set the bucket down on the counter next to the sink. A drink of water from the tap and then back outside again, this time heading towards the orchard. The wind was beginning to kick up stray leaves when he arrived to scrutinize the trees that had not yet leafed out. Mostly they were his citrus and other subtropical fruits, and he knew that eventually he'd just have to grasp the nettle and root them out. Most of them were only hardy to the mid-20s, with a few able to survive as low as 10 degrees for short periods of time, but none had been intended to survive in areas reaching 0 degrees. The -4 degrees they'd achieved in January had been just too much. He shrugged his shoulders in resignation and decided that after he'd gotten the corn in, he'd get out here and get them out. He was going to miss the oranges, but eventually he'd have new ones. Citrus was again going to be a rare and expensive treat for everyone, even for those that lived in Florida for years to come. This winter had broken every cold record in the state, and he hoped that he'd never live to see such a season again. The rain finally arrived and began to pelt itself across the land, so John started moving towards the gate. On the way out, he glanced over at the apple, pear, peach, and plum trees to see if he needed to thin the fruit. Not yet, but soon. As disastrous as the severe winter had been for his subtropicals, it had been good for them. He'd never seen such blossoms on the apples before, and even the 3 plum trees, which had never before been more than middling indifferent in their performance, had been covered in blossoms. The usual late spring freezes had taken most of the early blossoms, but it looked like they'd still get plenty. The blueberries and blackberries had run riot as well, and the buds on the grapevines were waxing fat. A particularly hard gust of wind took the hat off his head, so he had to trot to catch it before it ran off into the pasture, and the rainwater ran cold down the back of his neck. Retrieving his hat, he went into the workshop and began to service the push seeders he used for corn planting. They were 2 old Planet Juniors units that he bolted onto an impromptu frame so they'd stay a uniform distance apart as he walked the rows with them, dropping seed. He figured he could plant the entire 5 acres in just a couple of days if he worked steadily and the weather cooperated, which was never a certain proposition. If he wanted to expand the planting even more the next year, he'd need to look into a tractor-mounted seeder. But for now, he thought he could get by with what he had. Come harvest, picking the corn ears would be a family affair the way it used to be the way it used to before mechanization rendered the practice obsolete. He was even considering having a husking bee and inviting the neighborhood to participate with a barbecue at the end. The thought made him laugh out loud, and he remarked, "This is turning into a little house on the prairie. Next thing you know, Mel is going to start calling me Pa." He grinned as he greased the axles and began to reassemble the machines. He finished the cedars, and they made a measured tick-tick-tick sound as he pushed them around the floor. He put away his tools and began to putter about the shop, sweeping the floor and generally neatening up. He really wanted to go into the house and warm up the shortwave, but Heather was over today helping the kids bake a cake and make goodies for his and Ann's wedding anniversary celebration tonight. He wasn't supposed to know, so he figured he'd best wait a bit before going in. Ann had observed last night when she was writing down upcoming events on the calendar in their bedroom that May 1st was now going to be the start of a chain of celebrations across the summer. Their wedding anniversary was May 1st, Mel's birthday was May 13th, Cindy's May 20th, Neil's June 17th, Brittany's July 4th, a double celebration, Ann's July 21st, which was going to make for a lot of celebrating this year. He had to admit he was looking forward to it, though he'd have to keep up his traditional pretense of being uninterested. All right, good night. Thank you. God bless everybody. Bye-bye.